Welcome to the Keeping It Real podcast by Real World Academy, where we hear from top educators, entrepreneurs, and creative thinkers on how to design your future. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to episode 9 of the Keeping It Real podcast by Real World Academy. I'm Domenico Randazzo, Chief Operating Officer. I'm here with my cousin, Dr. Anthony Longo, co-founder and Chief Engagement Officer. And our guest today is a close friend of ours, a mentor of ours in many ways, Michael DePalma. He's been involved in many startups in the past, both locally in New Jersey and across the world. He's involved in tech, he's involved in healthcare, he's involved in education. And his relationship with us began due to the fact that he was the founder and manager of TEDx Morristown, and was the first person to give Real World Academy a public platform back in 2017. So thank you, Michael, for joining us. Hope all is well with you.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
So, you know, you're kind of a polymath of sorts. You're in a bunch of different fields. And I wanted to pick your brain on really, how did you get to this point? What brought you into the tech space, and how did that transfer into all these different altruistic endeavors that you have become a part of?
That's a huge loaded question. So there's a lot of things that conspire to create people like me, for lack of a better phrase, right? So one is insatiable curiosity. I want to know how everything works, which is, it's a pain in the ass for a lot of people, but for somebody like me, it's the way you have to live. So that draws you into, how does the world work? Technology, in particular, is actually kind of a funny story that when people ask me how I fell into tech, I actually fell into tech, believe it or not, and this is a true story, because I can't read my own handwriting. So when I was in high school, I'd take notes in a notebook like everybody did back then, right? We didn't have laptops. And I couldn't read what I had written, but the act of writing it down, I had developed a photographic memory so I could recall what I had written and where it was on the page, even if I couldn't, read it. And later on, when tech came out, things like Palm Pilots, for example, that would read what you had written and transcribe that into sort of, computer language so you can actually see text. I was fascinated by that, and that sort of drove me into, well, hell, if I can do that, maybe I can actually read what I wrote. So that's actually how I began in tech, because I can't read my own handwriting.
Only doctors are allowed to say that, though.
And he said, well, my initials are MD, and my path was originally to become a physician, right? I'm a subject of my education, but...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's been a long, strange trip, but the short answer to your question is just a lot of curiosity, just wanting to know how things work, and every question you answer begets 10 more questions, right? So it's this sort of exponential growth.
And were you always this curious? Did you always have a sense of curiosity even as a teenager, or is it something you developed later in life?
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword. So I've always been insatiably curious. So intellectual curiosity is a great thing, right? It's a great thing, but it's like many things. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. I've always been like that from childhood, right? The problem with that is that it doesn't always fit in real well with very structured education, right? So we have a much greater appreciation now for what we call neurodiversity. Right? People who don't necessarily think or act or operate the same way that other people may. So there's this sort of spectrum of this. And I was a terrible student, horrendous student. The reason is you'd put me in a room with people and we'd say, okay, so there's 30 kids in a room and we're going to do this. We're all going to do this thing at this pace, right? At this level for this amount of time. Mm-hmm. And that didn't work well with me. There's a very funny story. It's a true story. When I was a young kid, I was probably in grade school. And, in grade school, you were sitting in one class and, for 1 hour you do this, and for another hour you do that, and another hour you do that. And we had a reading hour. And so I would absolutely voraciously consume books about anything. And so we had a reading hour and I was consuming my books, and the teacher said, okay, everybody close your books. Let's move on to math. And I continued to read. And she said, Michael, will you join us? And I said, no, thanks. You go ahead. I'm just going to keep doing this. Right. So it's, it doesn't necessarily fit in real well, but I've always been that guy.
That must have frustrated you as a kid, though, being this intellectually curious person.
Sure.
Did you feel like you needed to prove yourself, or that teachers didn't respect you just because you didn't want to fit inside of those boxes? How did you navigate that?
Very poorly. Yeah. So for me personally, and I can't speak for everybody who sort of fits in this, a lousy student, I have a good brain, but a lousy student, because I had a hard time understanding or fitting into that mold, right? I'm going to teach you these facts. You're going to send me these facts back, right? I wanted to know why these were facts in the first place. Where did this come from, right? So we were operating at different levels. That was extremely frustrating for me. And I grew up thinking, I'm just a dumb kid because look at my grades.
So you weren't resentful. You were insecure about it.
So for me, not to psychoanalyze it, right? But for me, I internalized that as, I guess I'm just a dumb kid, right? I can't do these things. All these kids are getting A's, and I was physically incapable of doing homework. I had no interest. Right. I would come home and I'd be like, I know I have to do this thing, but I'm really not interested in doing this thing. I'm going to go out and play soccer or whatever the case may be, and that's what I did. So it was a very, very frustrating experience. To this day, I carry some of that with me, and I'll probably always will.
And it reminds me of Domenico in high school, where he was a good student per se. He was able to for the most part, to get very good grades, but he was just so disconnected from what he was doing. His interest was clearly music and music production, and the closest he had offered to that was concert band, jazz band, and those things to really don't apply to modern music, or a very small subset of course, it's still part of music, but didn't have it. And that was part of the reason that, Real World came to be.
Yeah.
And for myself, I memorized how to get good at the system. I didn't know why I was learning these things. I had no context to it. I just knew I got to get an A+ in math, because if I don't, I can't go to med school. And that was my only reason. Yep. I had no passion for most of the subjects except for science. Yep. And thankfully I had some good mentors who were, I had an MD as a teacher in high school, which is extremely rare. Sure. Opportunity, but that was the closest glimpse. And I was like a plant photosynthesizing all of the information that this physician taught to me, but it's the same thing. I felt disconnected, and I just knew I had to succeed in this strange system, this strangely competitive, weird, test-taking obsessed, cutthroat, abnormal system, which then continued not just into high school, but into college and med school. This strange, I got to be good at everything. I have to get perfect grades. I have to be cutthroat. I have to lie about how much I'm studying so that other people will study less so that I'll get a higher score. This weird
stuff. Those rules, right? And it got you to your outcome. But that's, so Anthony, that's what attracted me to you guys in terms of what Real World Academy was doing, right? And I don't know if you want me to tell the story, Domenico, of sort of how this all came to be.
Yeah, go ahead.
But, so for those unfamiliar with TED, right, Technology, Entertainment, Design, the series of talks, interesting people talk about interesting things for 15 minutes at a time, and it's sort of I think it's indicative of the way we live 21st century life in these sort of sound bites, right? I'm going to take this insanely complex, interesting thing and distill it into 15 minutes that has a high IQ and a high EQ, so that people pay attention to it. And so when we were doing TED, the first TED here in Morristown, we partnered with the school system. And, we needed a venue, and the high school, as it turns out, had a beautiful theater and stage and whatnot. And we said, this would be great. We're tuned into education. We want this to be about the town. We want this to be about the kids. And when I met with the Board of Ed and I met with the principal, I said, listen, I would love to put a student on stage. Now, how many kids were in the school? 1,000, 1,500, something like that?
A lot. Yeah, I think more.
It's a lot. It was a massive amount of kids. And I said, help me find, and these are the words I used, help me find an extraordinary kid that I can put on stage. And I said, I'm not going to vet them. Do me a favor, you and your teachers and whatnot, you guys figure out, your students best, right? Why don't you guys put your heads together, come up with 10 or 20 candidates and put them forth, and then I'll meet with them and let's figure out who the kid is. And what was interesting in that is, so let's say 10, they gave me 10 kids. All were good students, okay? 9 of them were excellent students. They had really good grades. But that's not what I was looking for. So go back to the words that I used. Find me an extraordinary kid, right? I didn't say find me a kid with good grades, because that, to me, to our earlier conversation, is somebody who's able to spit back at you what you spit back at them, right? You know, what are the dates of these famous battles, right? What I was interested in is somebody who had intellectual curiosity, or somebody who was thinking differently. And so Domenico jumped out at me because he was the kid who was like, oh, no, the world's a little bit screwed up and this is my plan to fix it. It's like, all right, that's the kid. And so that's how this came to be. I've always been passionate about education, probably because I had such a hard time with it. I didn't understand. I still don't understand why it's structured the way it's structured. I mean, we could all talk about the facts and figures. It was designed to create workers in a post-industrial economy. That all makes sense. But you know, education in my mind is still sort of, 19th century ideas, 20th century tools, and 21st century kids. And it doesn't seem to match up. So anybody who's doing interesting work in that space, I'm all for. And that's what I liked about Real World Academy. It's a different approach to how do we support people, kids, families, communities to get a better outcome from education than you might otherwise get.
Right. And
go ahead. It's funny. Can I go? Yeah. It's funny. Like that factory model was what they want the student to be, what the system wants the student to be was how I was, which was just, you get good grades, but you have no contextual understanding of the world. Right. You have no entrepreneurial spirit at all. And you're completely individualistic in, everything that you do. So it just reminds me of that. And Domenico was kind of breaking that mold,
right.
When he was younger. So that was, but he was, it's interesting.
Yeah. And I didn't expect to go here, but this is something I've just realized maybe within the past year. We spoke earlier about how we had a very impersonal relationship with our education and how we basically used it as a means to an end to pursue our passions, which we happen to have intrinsically. Most people don't. But, the reason why I was excelling in the humanities and in music wasn't necessarily because I was interested in the class content, if I'm being honest. It was because I needed it to get to the next level. And the same thing with you. I don't want to speak on your behalf, Anthony, but I think to a certain degree, that's the same thing with you pursuing the science classes. And to be honest, I'm realizing now that it really is just the way that it's taught and the way that there's no kind of communication and connection between the classes. Because I feel like I would have been way more interested in physics or geometry if it was contextualized in a way that was kind of culturally relevant and personally relevant. Because my entire life, I thought like, oh, I'm not into science, I'm not into physics. But just recently, like I've almost reminded myself, like, no, I am into that stuff. I do like space. And like when I was a kid, I loved space and astronomy and stuff like that. And I'm just now educating myself in the sciences because it was never made interesting to me as a kid.
Sure.
So I think part of it is, we have this system that is very impersonal and assessment based, but it's also just, there's no emphasis on the individual, which just makes it.
The individual can be, frankly speaking, the individual in a classroom can be disruptive, right? If you think about it. So think about a teacher's job, right? So class size is 20, 25, 30 kids, right? Their responsibility is I'm going to teach this group, this bolus of kids, this thing on this date and time so that we can move them along, right? Into this, their batch date. And so when you've got the one kid that's disruptive intellectually or otherwise, right, that's a challenge to your ability to move these kids down the conveyor belt, right? So it's, you're almost incented to not speak out. You're almost incented to not,
Some teachers know how to navigate those waters, though. I don't want to put too much blame on the teachers. I really think it's a system thing. I
agree 100%. Yeah, not to blame teachers. There's a series of incentives, right? You as a kid, right, are disincented to ask too many questions, right? Because it's just, these are the things we're learning, and this is what I want you to, this is what you need to know for the test.
Right.
but what I need to know for the test and what I want to know may be different things. All right. And so how do you manage that, right? And still keep it in the, and so I don't know that it's an intractable problem. I think that what will happen is over time, and I think we're kind of there now. In the 21st century, we have all sorts of solutions, technologies, democratized information that allow people who are autodidacts. You know, I consider myself an autodidact. I've taught myself basically everything that I know, right? Because I'm curious, but now I have ways to do that. And you'll see this, I mean, obviously, Domenico, like in music, right? So when I learned to play music, if I wanted to learn a song, I had to get a cassette tape and I would have to listen back and forth until I figured out what key it was in, what were the chords, what were the changes, right? Now I can go on YouTube and there's 10,000 covers of it, right? Which key do you want to learn it in? And here's the transposition, it's all there. Yeah. So access to that knowledge is much, much easier now. So it's much easier to be an autodidact. So what's interesting to me is that it's much easier to be an autodidact and have access to information. It's available to us, right? We all got these things. We can ask any question, right? And get any answer, yet we're still teaching a certain way.
Right.
At what point did those things sort of, come together?
Well, it even bleeds into college too, because the reason why college was so expensive in the past is because a proper education was exclusive. There was a certain amount of exclusivity there. But now you can go on the internet and teach yourself practically anything. Yeah. Maybe not a medical degree, but,
exactly.
things that don't require you to be in a physical space.
Even to some degree, even the medical degree can be done. A lot of our medical lectures were you could watch pre-recorded. A very minimal amount was hands-on the anatomy, and even the anatomy is becoming virtualized now. Wow. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So what's cool about that is that anybody who has a desire to learn can learn.
Yeah.
But the system in which we operate is still held to sort of an older set of standards, and that's where I think that the challenge comes in, and that's where an organization like Real World Academy is interesting to me, because you've got, I said something to you earlier, Domenico, on another conversation. I talked about, ability being evenly distributed and democratized, but opportunity isn't, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea that we can create these scaffolds to bring those opportunities to people who wouldn't otherwise have them, to give them a chance to compete in a system that isn't necessarily optimized for them, I think that's a beautiful thing to do. And I think over time, as that continues, that will naturally evolve as well, as more and more information becomes available, as student needs change, as the needs of the workforce changes, as society changes. All of those things will continue to evolve.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how, real world has even itself gone through many different iterations based on what the needs were. And, can you talk about how tough the education space is to make an impact? We went in, we weren't naive to how difficult it was, but like now seeing all of the things that schools are up against, and that even what we're up against when dealing with schools that have certain expectations that don't, budgets, realities of, it's such a hard space to break into.
Yeah, it is. Well, listen, I'll say this, just about every space is a hard space to break into, right? Generally speaking, when we talk about business models, and I'll sort of refer to education as a business model because it kind of works, right? In business models, there's this concept of what we call product market fit, right? What are people looking for, and do you have a thing that fits that model? And so there's a lot of sort of disconnect in that. Now, there's a lot of good connections, right? Google Classroom is a good product market fit because they realized that, everybody just needed a way to store docs, submit docs, have access to docs, that sort of. So that's a good product market fit, right? Does it necessarily change education? No, but it's a good product market fit. And so that's one aspect of it. Two, businesses by definition are constantly changing and evolving as the world around us changes. Technologies change, laws change, people change, everything changes. And so, what was a brilliant solution 5 years ago may not necessarily fit now. And so the world's constantly evolving. The ability to understand that and evolve with it. In business, we call those pivots, right? But, does that same analog exist in education? I would argue that to some degree it does. So it's a challenge. But I think the larger thing to look at, like in business, we say you get what you incent for, right? So if I incent somebody to do a thing, I'm going to get that thing in spades because they're incented to do it, right? I'll give you an example. I have a customer that I work with that has a whole team of salespeople. And they would incent their salespeople to create LinkedIn connections, okay? Now, the goal of a sales organization is to do what? To generate sales, right? To generate people who are willing to sign on the line that is dotted and write you a check to pay you to do the thing that you do. But if you incent a sales team to collect connections on LinkedIn, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get a whole lot of connections on LinkedIn and no sales, right? And so it's understanding the bigger picture, right? So what is education for? Is it a means to an end? As Anthony, you described it, right? I have to do this because in order to achieve my goal, this is the path that gets me there, right? Or is it something else? And I think the answer is it's a little bit different for everybody. For me, it wasn't necessarily with a specific endpoint that was fixed in mind. And subsequently, I've taken many paths, right? I've traveled many more miles than most people have. I've had a much richer experience. Some may say checkered, right? But that was the point, is that was my path. Other people are much more focused. So when we have an environment that allows each student to do the things that are important to them and yet still achieve something demonstrable for their future, I think that's the whole thing.
Right.
You know, it's interesting when you made me think of, with the experiences, I just wonder, and this is a lot what we're banking on with education, that students are eventually going to be, whether it's in public education or primary education or even secondary, is you're going to be eventually paying for the experiences and not the actual rote content. And we're seeing that already, but it's going to be so different 5 years from now what it is now. Like I think of, school, we're seeing it with the virtualized learning that students are kind of teaching themselves things. And then what are you really paying for the school education? Social experiences, connections with others, which is missing during the pandemic to some extent. Yep. Medical school, I was thinking about when you said before, when you asked about, or when Domenico was mentioning, how much was really done. A lot of the things can be virtualized, but what couldn't be virtualized was the hospital rotations. When you're actually going there, there's no substitute. You can try a million ways to do it, but there's just no substitute for being in the hospital. And so that's what I feel like I paid for medical school, was the hospital rotations and the chance to work in the anatomy lab and the things that were not virtualized. Yeah. College to some, for Domenico, I think of, he always talks about in college where, he took some interesting classes, definitely at NYU, but what he really paid for in that 6-figure education was for the connections to professors who were in industry, connections with other like-minded, extremely artistic people that were brought together to do these artistic projects and collaborations. That's what he paid for.
I basically had to pay. I mean, you did the same thing. I had to pay to get hired. I had to pay to get a job. Like the biggest the biggest piece of value that I got from NYU was the relationship that I have with my current mentor, who hired me at his studio as a studio manager. And I learned more just working at the studio every night, being in the game, as opposed to reading about it in a lecture hall. So not to say that go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, there's two really interesting points there. One is the concept of experiential learning, right? Which, so everybody learns differently. And we've heard that, chopped up so many different ways. You're a kinetic learner, you're this, you're that, visual, et cetera. Experiential learning is fascinating. There's things that there is no substitute, right? I can't explain. I tell this about, parenthood, right? You can read every book on the planet. It's never going to teach you what it means to be a parent, right? There are things, right? What was the movie, Good Will Hunting, right? What does the Sistine Chapel smell like, right? There are things that you can only learn one way, and that is to experience them. And that's kind of why we're here, right? That concept of experience. And intellectual curiosity drives those experiences. What happens if I ride my bike down this cliff, right? You know what I mean? It's, I may fall, I may do it. It's those experiences. You can't read about that. Yeah. Go ahead and read all the Jack Kerouac novels you want, but it's not an excuse for going out and actually doing it.
Right.
But there's another issue that you sort of raised, Domenico, and you too, Anthony, which is the inequity of the system, right? The idea that you're buying yourself a job, that you're creating an opportunity to have other opportunities, right? And that's going back to some of the things we talked about before, right? This idea that ability is evenly distributed, but opportunity not. Anything that allows us to open those opportunities to people. And democratized learning is one of those things. I mean, you can go on edX or Udemy or any of these other things and have access to massively open online courses from MIT and Harvard and Yale and any place else. You can learn anything from anyone, anywhere. That's an amazing thing, right? And then the question is, can you apply that the same way that somebody who went sort of the traditional route, right? So I can take a class from MIT online, but that's not the same as saying I went to MIT, right? Those things are still different. Although the information exchange may be the same, the end result or the end opportunity of that may not, because of the things you mentioned, Anthony, which is, those experiences, that socialization, those connections, those mentorings, right? So those are things I think we still have to solve for as we move forward.
And the community that's created from being a part of a university. And I think
it used to be a rich landed gentry who was allowed to, was the only people who had access to these, universities. So there was no other way.
And I think it is that still to a degree, and it's going to be that even more so in the coming years. Real World Academy does create that community for students. And I said this on another episode, but I'll say it again. It's not like it's not like we're patenting some super unique invention. It's not like we invented the iPhone. All Real World Academy does is we're listening to students on a one-on-one basis and creating that relationship that allows them to design a future for themselves and ultimately know themselves. We're not doing something super unique here. It's just that there's no other vessel that is able to do this at scale, because nobody else is able to nobody else has the bandwidth to have personal relationships with students from the day they start high school through the day they graduate college.
Yeah, well, it's back to that incentive model that we talked about, right? So it's, if we're not incenting for that, then we're not going to do that. Right. And that's sort of the beauty of this.
So, Michael, I want to get back to your story, Michael, and I'm curious, coming out of high school and coming out of college, you had this mindset where you're not a good student. How long did it take you to build that confidence and to ultimately be able to, mature intellectually into the person you are now? Did it take decades? Did it take years? What was that path like?
That's a really good question. So, I didn't go to college until I was 23, right? So I came out of high school and I worked because I had no other choice. And so that's what I did. And I worked for a number of years, and I just had this moment of epiphany at one point. I was like, you know what? There's really no reason why I shouldn't become a physician. I'm just going to go figure that out. And that was more guts than brains. I was just like, well, screw it. I'm just going to go ahead and quit my job. I'll work part-time. I'll enroll myself in college. I'll commute. And that's what I did. And I got through college, and I did very well in college because I was interested, and because to a great extent, it was far less structured than high school and grammar school and grade school were, right? It was, hey, listen, I don't, from a professor's perspective, I don't care if you show up or not, right? I don't care if you learn or not. I'm going to teach the class. If you show up and give me what I want, if you can demonstrate that you learned, then great, you'll do well. It happened to be subject matter that I was interested in. So I did very well in college, despite the fact that I wasn't really a good student. I wouldn't say it was easy, but it allowed me to do things. When I came out of school, I had already fallen into technology. So whereas my original intent was to apply what I had learned in bio and neurobio to a career in medicine, I veered off into health-focused technology, right? The confidence question that you're asking is an interesting one, because I think at some point you stop really caring to some extent. You cut yourself a little bit of slack, right? Here's what I learned about myself, or here what I finally figured out about myself, right? I'm going to be intellectually curious until the day I die. I'm going to be unfocused until the day I die because I'm interested in way too many things, right? I have a thick skin because I know I didn't take that path. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of imposter syndrome, right? Many of us suffer from imposter syndrome. That happens to me on a daily basis. I'll find myself in rooms, whether I'm giving a talk or I'm in a meeting, and I'm saying to myself, what am I doing here, right? Whether or not that's real or not, that's sort of my own head trash. But at some point, you just get to a point where you're like, these are the things that make me tick. These are the things that I live for. These are the things I find interesting. That's what I'm going to spend my time doing. And so I don't know that it's confidence so much as it's just the willingness to shed all the sort of, the baggage of it and just, this is me. I find this really cool. I'm going to go ahead and do it.
So that actually brings me to another topic. We talk so much about loving what you do and kind of protecting that. I'm curious how you navigated that philosophy alongside the reality of needing to make money. So how do you balance, how do you value financial security versus doing what you want to do? And how have you been able to find that balance in your career?
That's a fascinating question and a really, really good one to talk about. So I'm a father of 3, right? And so for many years, I would tell my kids, and you guys probably heard this yourself, right? Find something that you love. And that's the old adage, right? If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. That's all great. I recently had someone challenge me on that. And I actually love this sort of line of thinking, which was, it's not so much about doing what you love. Find what you're good at, right? What is it that you excel at? What is it that you can do just inherently in your sleep that people will pay you for? And the person gave an example. He said, you know what? You think people are passionate about tax law? You think somebody grew up saying, oh my God, I want to be a tax accountant, right? And those people may exist, and they're not to be pejorative, right? But in all likelihood, what happened is these are people who found out they were good at certain things, right? They had a skill, they had an ability that people were willing to pay for. And by the way, when that happens, you become passionate about that thing pretty quick, right? You could be insanely passionate about music, but if you can't play, it doesn't matter,
right?
If you can play and people are willing to pay you, guess what? It's much easier to be passionate about music. So my thinking on that has shifted a little bit. It's great to have passions. Everyone should have them, no matter what they are. But I think it's more important to be able to figure out what is your gift? What is it that you're inherently good at? What can you bring to the world that has value, because you can develop passions around that thing.
Right.
There are some school systems that I think do that. Like if you look at some of the European models, in Germany, for example, they incent a larger number of students to go into technical schools, for example. Right? Here in the US, we have this tendency to just drive everybody to a 4-year college, which is obviously exorbitantly expensive. We see some of the economics of that. We see some of the inequities of that. It's one way to do things. There may be other ways. So I think, long-winded answer to your question, right? I think the passions are important, but I think it's also important to really look in that mirror, or have someone help you look in that mirror and figure out, what is this thing that you can bring to the world that's going to help you create a living, right?
Yeah. And I want to emphasize this, because when people say, find something that you love, it's a very idealist perspective. And even your example of the tax attorney, maybe the tax attorney isn't necessarily passionate about, making people pay their taxes, but maybe they're passionate about the strategy behind, calculating the different expenses and all that. And that's a strength of theirs that exercises their brain in a way that they enjoy.
Exactly.
Or helping people, the satisfaction of helping people that were, that needed it, help them save money, help them get out of financial problems. It's in medicine too. Like some people go into fields that maybe were not that glamorous, they didn't really like, but they were just so good at that thing. And people were like, you know what? They saw a patient who was like, you know what? You changed my life with this. And so it can happen. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And all of those things are baked into this journey, right? So every individual, we get to choose a path in life at some point, right? Mm-hmm. And hopefully that's a well-informed path. Hopefully it's not just been something that's been laid out. It's something that you feel, something that you feel that you have a degree of success. listen, I'm 5'8", right? I'm never going to play center for the Knicks, right? It's just not going to happen, right? But there's other skills that I have that led me to all the different things that I do, right? So I have a scientific background, I have a technology background, I'm passionate about people and healthcare, right? So I bridge all of those things, right? So that's where I live. I live at the intersection between human health and technology, right? Because those are both things that are fascinating to me, right? If I do it well, I get to help people, right? In lots of different ways, right? And at the same time, I can make a decent living doing that. So that's the niche that I found by taking things that I genuinely liked, right? I am interested in, I continue to be interested in. I consume information about these fields voraciously every day of my life because I'm constantly fascinated by what's new, what else is going to happen, how is this going to change our lives?
Yeah.
And that's really what you wish for every student, is to find the thing that they're good at, right? And they may surprise themselves by what they're good at, right? But that's the thing that you're good at ends up becoming something that you can get paid for. When you can get paid for that, you develop passion for it pretty quickly. It's fascinating.
Right. You're passionate for the things that you're good at, no doubt. And I think, something that a lot of students need to hear, even if you get the dream job, even if you find your passion, there's always going to be work involved on the day-to-day. And
Absolutely.
in order to be, you have to have a certain stamina and you have to have a certain, strong stomach for dealing with the day-to-day work. Even in my career, I'm not doing the guitar solo on stage. I'm doing that maybe 5% of the time. In every other situation, I'm repairing a microphone or I'm tuning someone's vocal or I'm negotiating with some A&R. Like that's all that busy work is what's required in order for me to, be on stage and be doing the guitar solo.
That's 100%. So this concept of perseverance, right? Perseverance, resilience, right? Dedication to what it is that you're doing. And being good at it and being passionate about it is what gets you through that sort of stuff, right? And what did Edison say, right? 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration.
Right.
People forget that, right? Everything that is worth doing is going to require work.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that's worth doing is going to smack you down at some point, right? The greatest hockey players on earth had to learn to skate. Right? Yeah. There was a moment in time where Wayne Gretzky didn't know what ice skates were, right? We all go through that. And, if you read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about that, the off-quoted 10,000 hours, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you put in the work, you do what's required to do these things. A passion or an interest in those things makes those 10,000 hours easier.
Right.
People don't see the behind the scenes that you're describing, Domenico, right? So when you see somebody ripping a guitar solo on stage, you don't see the 10,000 hours spent in a bedroom learning scales or figuring out progressions, right? But that's what it requires. And I think that's true for everyone, for every field. Anthony, you just lived through med school, internship, residency, right? You had to put in the work. And you continue to do so, right? Domenico, you with your music career, right? You put in the work. And to your point, right? For every 5% of your time that you get to rip the guitar solo, it's 95% of your time doing the work to get you there.
Right.
I think that's for all of us.
And I think it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop at the 10,000 hours. It's not like somebody hands you a certificate when you turn 25 and it's like, okay, you've been studying for 10 years on this one thing and now you're an expert.
The bell doesn't go off. Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right. You never get a handshake. You never get a job well done.
It's funny. You may be familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? This concept that the less you know about something, the more convinced you are you're an expert, right? But what's interesting about that is that I find out the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know.
Absolutely.
Right? And that was the thing for education that I've always been most fascinated by, right? The things that I remember from college were the following, right? One is an appreciation for the great thinkers that came before. All the people that you may not have known, but now know, right? And what they've contributed to the world. That was a great thing. And then the other thing is that intellectual curiosity, right? The ability to keep learning things and asking questions. And as I said before, every question begets 10 more. Mm-hmm. And then each of those 10 beget 10 more. So that exponent. And the more you learn, the more you realize how much there is that you may never know, right? But that can either frustrate you and you can quit, or you can have that resilience, that perseverance, and say, you know what, I'm going to keep doing this because it's interesting to me,
Right.
and keep moving forward.
So I'm going to selfishly ask for a piece of advice because I think it'll apply to a lot of other people too. As someone who, like, you admitted that you're not a focused person, you're interested in so many different things. And I think
Right.
I fall into that category too.
Mm-hmm.
How are you able to strategize in terms of a career path? How are you able to kind of harness that curiosity and not let it spread yourself too thin and take on too many things at once? How do you focus yourself? How do you discipline yourself in order to
I'm going to give you an unpopular answer, and that is I don't. Right? I allow my interests and my lack of focus to take me to places that have outcomes. What most people don't see is all of the work that I do that doesn't necessarily have a successful outcome, right? So for every company that I build that maybe does something, there may be 4 that don't go anywhere. Yeah. For every relationship that you build, some work and some don't, right? For every product that you build, some work and some don't. Some markets are great, some markets aren't. It's I'll use another hockey reference, right? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I take a lot of shots, right? And so I operate at a high level in a lot of different areas at once, because the more I do that, the more I create these cross-pollinations, the more sort of, gravitas I create, the more momentum I create. Something always comes from it. You're never 100% sure where it's going to be. But here's what I've learned. If I don't do the work, nothing will happen, right? If I do the work, there will be a good end result. I can't necessarily tell you exactly where it's going to be, right? For me. Now, if I want to end up at a very focused point, I can, follow a very distinct, very strict path, right? And I'll get there the same as anybody else. Or I can sort of meander around and get there. So I think a lack of focus, I think it's not really a lack of focus. It's knowing when, where, and how to apply focus, right? And still allowing my brain to work the way that it wants, to do all these other side things, right? But still be able to achieve goals. So for me, it's multi-threading, if you want. I hate the phrase multitasking, right? But there's a lot of different things going on in my head. Some are business focused, some are family focused, some are friends, some are, creative. I want to paint, I want to play music, whatever the case may be. I try to indulge all those things. And, if I have the mental bandwidth to do it, then I do it. And if I don't, I'll change.
So it seems like you've built up an armor for things not working out. Is that something that's intrinsic to you, or did you have to build that over time? How do you cope with failure? And what's your advice in dealing with others coping with failure?
That's probably the most important question you asked, right? So we have a tendency, we as a society, I think, to shrink from failure, right? Failure, I think we need to redefine that word, right? Because, I'll use Edison again, right? He 999 light bulbs didn't work, and then finally found one that did, right? Those weren't failures. Those were iterations of learning, right? So you do a couple things. First of all, failure is a bruise, not a tattoo, right? It shows that you had the intestinal fortitude to put yourself out there and try something, right? To do the work and to learn what's going to work. Everyone fails. Everyone on the planet that's ever tried to do anything will fail at some point. There's nothing wrong with that, right? That's actually, it's an invaluable thing. If you show me somebody who's never failed, I am not interested in speaking with that person. I'm not interested in working with that person, because they're not going to have the resiliency, the persistence, right? The thick skin that's required. But there's a lot that you can do to sort of think through that, right? One of the things that I found invaluable, and some people have a hard time with, is the relentless prosecution of ideas, right? So there's a mindset when people talk about things like brainstorming, for example. Oh, let's brainstorm, let's throw things at the wall. The simple fact is that not every idea is a good one, and that's okay, right? Again, it's about that sense of ownership, right, and personal ego and pride. Not every idea is a good one, and the way you test that is you prosecute the idea. I have ideas every day, and once I put them under stress and pressure. Some of them fall apart. If they fall apart, it wasn't a good idea, and on I moved. Now, was that a failure, or was that just a process?
Right.
So I think that the more we sort of internalize that idea, the idea that, relentless prosecution of one's ideas, of understanding the situation in which we're sort of, positing these ideas, understanding the environment around it, understanding the need to persevere, understanding the concept of resilience, understanding that you're going to fail sometimes and that's okay. I think those are things I would love to see taught in schools, right? You want to build an entrepreneurial mindset. Those are invaluable skills for entrepreneurs, no matter where they come from, right? No matter what it is you try to do, if you learn those things, you will be far better prepared to do great things in the world, at least in my experience. And I actually got something here. Let me show this to you or tell you about it. Give me 1 second. So I'll read it to you real quick. Mm-hmm. So this is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. It says, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat."
And we teach that at Real World Academy.
There you go.
That's a part of our regular curriculum. I love that quote, and I love everything that says.
I agree too.
I want to ask just one more question, and then we're going to move to a Q&A section.
Sure.
And I know that you might be biased in this answer, but that's okay. For a young entrepreneur, I'm curious, when's the right time to be a disruptor, and when's the right time to adapt and conform to the system to get what you want?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So businesses follow. There's a path for industries, right? So a disruptor, by definition, right, means that you've created a new way to do a thing that other people are doing. Okay, mm-hmm. So we'll use the tired example of Netflix and Blockbuster, right? Blockbuster had a lock on how people consumed media in their home, right? And they had a business model that was predicated on you went to a physical location, you chose the media, right? You brought it back to your house, you put it in a device that you can't buy anymore, right? And you consume that media and then you return it. And then came this thing called streaming. Now, streaming is a fundamental disruption to sort of the sneakernet approach of I'm going to go get a piece of media, I'm going to bring it back to my house, and I'm going to watch it. So there's this sort of the law of diffusion of innovation, right? So early on, if you can find a disruptive way to do that, that's great. What happens in every business is once disrupted, what will happen is suddenly lots of people were doing streaming, right? So it wasn't just Netflix. Now everybody streams. What will happen is at some point, okay, all of those streaming services will be disrupted by whatever else is next, right? And what happens is once you build an established business model, right? So Netflix is now the established business model. Streaming is the established business model. Disruption in that field will not come from streaming companies because they're beholden to their business model, and their business model is streaming. They're not going to disrupt themselves. They will be disrupted from the outside by somebody who figures a new way to do it. And that's always the way businesses run. So there's this S-shaped curve of innovation, right? It's called the disruption of innovation curve, if you want to read about it. And that's the way it curves. So for me, you can be a disruptor, and it's an overused phrase, right? But you can be a disruptor if you can find a way to do something that people need, right? Cheaper, faster, better, in a novel way that has the capability and ability to compete with sort of established business models. that's your swing. That's your chance. If you can build a product market fit and disrupt an existing business model, then yeah, you change the world. But know that that is a limited thing, right? That will not work in perpetuity. Every company is eventually disrupted by another version of itself. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of different ways that that can be disrupted. It can be disrupted by technology. It can be disrupted by just society. It can be disrupted by intangibles, things like trust. There's lots of things that can potentially disrupt industries. So I don't know that there's a time. I think it's really just understanding, do I have a disruptive way to address an existing business model? And if I do, can I build a business doing that? Knowing full well that a year, 5 years, 10 years down the line, you will be disrupted by someone doing something else.
Right. So this is a direct, this directly ties into one of the questions that was asked by one of our mentors, Daniel. And it's a broad question, but I think it's broad in a good way. What is key advice that you would give to a teenager or college student who has visions of starting their own business? And I think maybe you want to answer this, what advice would you give from a mental perspective? How would you develop that mental fortitude and have realistic expectations of what's to come?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it speaks to what we talked about before, right? I sometimes give talks on the journey of entrepreneurship, right? What it's like. I'll give you a quick maudlin quote right now, right? Which is, every corpse on Everest was once a highly motivated individual. Yeah. You can't start companies by reading about starting companies, right? You have to do the work. So all the things that we talked about today, I think are the things that I would really stress to anybody who wanted to choose this way of life, right? So you have to have the ability to focus when, where, and how you need to focus, and understanding where you need to be open, right? So you have to have those two skills. They are different, right? And back to what we talked about with education, right? Entrepreneurship is not about having a distinct set of facts and being able to regurgitate them. Entrepreneurship is not a straight line by any stretch of the imagination. It is filled with peaks and valleys and double back and 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's all over the place. And the only way to do that is to be open to that. To be open to listen, you have to be able to persevere. You have to have that resilience. You have to leave your ego at the door. I think that's a very often overlooked thing, right? You have to know who can help you in your journey. I think mentorship and having the ability to talk to people who've either been there or can help you along your way is absolutely invaluable. If you think about education systems, we talk about networks, right? The idea that you're not just getting an education, you're getting a network of people that come from that environment. Why do people go to Harvard? Well, not just because it's a great education, but because you have access to everybody else who went to Harvard, right? It's that network, right? And those are the things that I think create. The other things I would tell people is, now I'm partial to tech, and I would tell people, fall in love with the problem that you're trying to solve, not your solution. And that may seem counterintuitive, right? When people build a business or have a disruptive idea or whatever the case may be, they often focus on nothing but that thing, right? And the problem is you really need to be in love with the problem that you're trying to solve, because your solution may not be the best. And if you think that it is, you'll stop thinking about it and caring about it, right? And you really need to keep your eye on that prize and constantly iterate and constantly think about, what is it that's next? What's going to happen tomorrow? How do I evolve and meet the needs of the people that I'm here to serve, right, as I go through this? And so the advice that I would give is really, those are the things you need to be able to do, is, right, build a network, have that perseverance and resilience, check your ego at the door.
What do you mean by that?
What's that?
What do you mean by check your ego at the door?
So I think there are a cadre of people who think it's all about them, right? And it's funny because it's so easy to point to sort of the prototypical archetypal, entrepreneurs, the folks in the black turtlenecks pointing off the distance and their vision for the future, and the Steve Jobs of the world, the Jeff Bezos of the world, the Bill Gates of the world. And those are all brilliant, brilliant people who are known to have fairly massive egos, right? But I'll be a little bit off color here, right? Being an asshole doesn't make you the next Steve Jobs. It just makes you an asshole.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think it's understanding that humility and the ability to understanding that there is a lot for you to learn, right? Particularly if this is the first time you've done this, right? Have the ability to check that ego at the door and say, you know what, I'm going to go into this open and I'm going to learn from anyone and everyone. And I'm going to open my mind to as much information as I can. I'll synthesize as much as I can. I'll learn as much as I can, and I'll adjust as I move. Right. So, I think lots of people will talk about the singular focus of the visionary founder, and that's a great story, but the data suggests that the people who are successful don't usually follow that path.
This reminds me a great piece of advice that I got in high school from my teacher, Mr. Madden. Shout out, Mr. Madden, if you're listening. He spoke about this in the context of writing essays, but it applies to this topic as well. He said, one of the worst things you could do is try to be clever for the sake of being clever. You never just want to be clever for no other reason than to sound smart, because then that makes you an asshole with nothing to back it up. So yeah, I totally agree with that. You need to focus on the substance you need to focus on what you're trying to solve, rather than some kind of image that you're trying to protect for yourself. Because
that's the ego part. It's not about the image. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Tell me what it is that you do and how you're going to change the lives of people or the world or economics or whatever it is that you happen to be doing.
Right.
It's that. What's the problem that you're trying to solve? And you will find that your solution to that thing will continue to evolve over time because the thing itself will continue to evolve.
Mm-hmm. One last question from our friend and mentor, Matteo Cardona. Being that you've started companies, brought together a TED Talk, etc., can you touch on the importance of who you know versus what you know?
Okay. It's huge. Who you know and what you know are different things. As we just alluded to before, right? Those mentors, those connections, those relationships. We talked about Harvard before, right? And the same is true for every great institution of learning, right? These networks of alumni, for lack of a better phrase, right? In every area, that network effect is far more powerful than what you know. The world is littered with brilliant people who you will never hear about because they don't have access to a network. Right? That's what we talked about before when we talked about ability and opportunity, right? A network is, by definition, opportunity. It's the connections that will allow you to grow in. So I would also urge entrepreneurs to build those networks. Find people in the fields that you're interested in who are doing work. Find people that you respect. Reach out to those people. Ask them questions, right? Don't be a giant pain, but you have to get out there. You have to put yourself in situations where you can have conversations with those people. Build those connections, and those connections will in turn create other connections, right? What we all do to some extent is we monetize who we know, right? Our ability to pick up the phone and say, hey, listen, I'm doing this thing. I know you know so-and-so. Let's set up a conversation. Hugely important. Very little happens in a vacuum, right? We like to tell stories about people who lock themselves in a garage and, are suddenly worth $1 billion. Those are few and far between. And what you don't hear about is all the hours of work, all the network connections, all of the work that's done to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a very reductionist explanation of success. It wasn't just them sitting in the garage. It was way more than that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Michael DePalma, for joining us on the Keeping It Real podcast. This was an amazing conversation. I definitely learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners are going to really appreciate this one, too. We'd love to have you back on whenever you're around next.
Anytime, guys. My pleasure. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. We'll see you for next episode of the Keeping It Real podcast. Peace.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Keeping It Real podcast by Real World Academy. If you're a student looking for a mentor or a parent looking to help your kid design a happy life and a successful career, visit our website at realworldacademy.org and subscribe to us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and wherever you listen to podcasts to hear more exclusive content on how to design your future.